Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the first story from chapter 46 of the Road to Latin textbook called De Orgetorigis Consiliis I. So this is talking about Orgetorix, right, and his plans and the continuing the narrative of the Helvetii and their migration, which is really the first book of De Bello Gallico, right? So before we dive too far into it, like I always tell you, if you want more resources on this story or anything like that, you want vocab help, grammar notes, whatever it might be, you can find everything on my website. It's all there for you. There's a couple of different things that will help you out that just go beyond the Road to Latin textbook. So if you're interested or you need help with anything, feel free to take a look. The other thing that I'd tell you before we get too far into the translation is before you do anything, in terms of reading or trying to translate the story, the first thing you have to do is make sure that you have the vocab down. It's just really difficult to read and understand anything when you don't know what the words mean. So your first step should always be taking a look at the vocab list, right, for chapter 46 and practicing it until you feel really, really comfortable with the new words. Now, to help you with that, if you want, on my website, I've put up a Quizlet, a Gimkit, and a Bluekit. These are just things that I use in my own class to help my students with it. So if you need help or you just want some resources, again, find it, but always start with the vocab first, because that's the best way to really dive into a new chapter, learn the new words. The other thing that I'd recommend, particularly if you've made it this far into the textbook, every chapter is going to have a new grammar unit that's tricky to understand, right? In this case, chapter 46 is starting with the subjunctive mood, which is really a tricky thing for my Latin students, at least, to understand and kind of wrap their head around. And since the story is using the subjunctive mood, I would recommend that you read through the grammar notes first. So try to read through, even if you don't fully understand all of it, at least take a look at it and try your best to take some notes and see if you can make some sense of it. If you use my website, there's videos there that will help you out as well, and just my own notes to help you process it. But that's something you really want to do before you read the story. That way you can use the story to actually understand the grammar and see it in context, right? So you'll see a lot of subjunctive verbs, and this way you'll at least be able to understand them and try to work your way through the story. Again, if you don't read the grammar first, it's going to be very confusing. You're not going to be able to figure out what's going on. Okay, so I'd always recommend that you start with the grammar, try your best. And at the beginning of this video, after we kind of go through all this, I'll walk you through the basics of the grammar so we can see it as we read the story. Now, once you've done that and you feel comfortable enough to read the story, what I'd always recommend you do is read the story aloud. You've heard me say this before, but if you can read it to a classmate, work on your speaking, your pronunciation, that's always a great thing to do. And then if they can read it back to you, right, whoever you have in class, when they read it back to you, they'll be working on their own speaking and pronunciation, but you can work on your listening skills. You never want to shut those off. Latin is a language, right? You don't want to just do it in your head. That's not what it's intended to be. So bring it to life. Work on your speaking, your pronunciation. You'll hear mine in this video. Not that mine is anything ever fantastic, but you always want to keep working at it, right? That way you're actually treating it like a language. The other thing I'd recommend you do is try the read and reread method. So read through the story once, write down any problem areas you might have, make a list of whatever it might be, sentences, words, whatever. When you're done with the entire story, take a look at your list and try to figure out where you went wrong. If it was words and phrases you didn't know, it could be a vocab issue. That's pretty straightforward. Just look up the word in a dictionary, either in Road to Latin or whatever, an external dictionary you use, whatever it might be. That's a pretty easy one to fix. If it's grammar, it will probably be the grammar for the chapter. So in this case, subjunctive mood. So this is where you can kind of start to tweak your grammar skills too, and challenge yourself and be like, I don't understand what's happening in this sentence, but let me try to figure out what's going on. It's probably subjunctive, right? That's always a good way to start as well. So once you do that, you give the story another shot and you just repeat the process over and over again. And as you do it, your list of problems should get shorter and shorter until you're able to read through the whole story, start to finish, without any problems or close to as few problems as you can. That's how you know that you're ready to move on. You've really understood it. So if you haven't done any of that, pause the video, go back, work on that. But if you feel like you're in a pretty good place, let's go through a little bit of the grammar just to refresh your memory, and then we'll translate it together. Okay, so here's a very quick overview of the grammar. I can't give you a full one because it's just too big of an idea. It'll probably take a little bit more time to process, but the basics are this. In this chapter, you're learning what's called subjunctive mood, which is really like the bane of every Latin student's existence. Or if you've taken one of the Romance languages, like I remember taking it in French, I thought it was horrible. That's kind of the same thing, right? It's sort of an obstacle for everyone learning Latin. But if you can really take it into pieces, which is what Road to Latin does, they break it into smaller chunks, I think it's very manageable. So in general, the first thing you have to understand is that Latin verbs have what we call mood, and you've actually seen a few of them before. So the first one is indicative mood, and this is what you learn in chapter 1 of any Latin textbook, right? The first verb you run into is indicative mood. It's just stating a fact, right? Indicating a fact. That's why we call it that. So if you were to just say, I am happy, lovely, that's a fact. The verb I am, right, or am in this case, would be indicative, and you move on with life. Okay. The other one you've seen is the imperative mood. So this is when you're giving orders or commands to someone. So when you're telling someone to run, you don't necessarily say you should run or you run or something like that. You just say run. That command is called the imperative. It's a different mood, right? It almost has a different vibe to it. And that's the idea. So you've seen indicative and imperative. The third one you're going to see is subjunctive. Okay. So you're not really changing your translation of verbs necessarily. You're still dealing with the same tenses, but it's the mood, right? It's sort of the vibe of the sentence, the sort of background of it is why you would use subjunctive. It has a lot of uses, but in general, it's that hypothetical action is really what it's expressing. Could be commands, doubts, wishes, conditions. The list goes on and on and on, right? Purposes are what we're going to learn in this chapter. But in general, it's sort of the gray area of Latin when you're not stating a specific fact, right? You're not indicating a fact. It's more hypothetical. That's what the subjunctive really is. So if you were to say something like, I went to the store to buy vegetables, right? That would be subjunctive because we're not entirely sure that that's the reason you went to the store, right? It sounds silly, but in Latin, when you're using the subjunctive, that's why, right? Because you're not indicating a specific fact. So in this chapter, what we're going to do is we're going to start with the present and imperfect subjunctive. Let's just look at how they're formed, and then we'll deal with what they're actually used for. Okay, so forming it is sort of the easier part. Understanding when you'd use it is a little bit trickier. Okay, so let's start with present subjunctive. Okay. For the present subjunctive, you do the same thing as you would for present indicative, but you're switching around the stem vowel. So what I mean by that is if you go to the infinitive, you drop the RE, you have a specific vowel there, right? So the ones we've learned are in first conjugation, it would be an A. Think of the verb ambulare, you drop the RE, you have an A. Second conjugation, you have an E, same with third. Fourth conjugation rather has an I. Those are the stem vowels. And you learn that sometimes you switch them around, but just in general, there's going to be a vowel when you get rid of the RE on the infinitive, right? We call it the stem vowel. To make the present subjunctive, you're going to switch around the stem vowel. So when you have a first conjugation verb, that A is going to switch to an E when it's subjunctive. And in second conjugation, the E is going to add an A. So it's going to become EA in the subjunctive. In third conjugation, E switches to A. In third IO, right, it switches to an IA. The E goes to IA. And in fourth, the I goes to IA, right? So if you want, a mnemonic that a lot of people use is to say she wears a diamond tiara, right? And there's different versions of this. But the vowels that I highlighted here, the E and she, the EA and wears, right? Those vowels represent the different vowel switches you're making if you just run down in order first, second, third IO, and fourth, right? So E, EA, A, IA, and IA. Okay, so that's the idea. You're not changing the ending. You're not doing anything like that. You're just switching what vowel is in front of the ending or that stem vowel, and that's what makes it subjunctive. One way I always thought of it is it's the opposite of what you'd expect. So A is kind of the opposite of E. E is the opposite of A. That's what you're doing. You're switching things around. So the verb is going to look different, and that's how you know it's subjunctive. So let's just take a quick look. This is a chart of present subjunctive active voice. So you can see portare, right? If you drop the RE, you have an A. We flip it to an E. So you get portem, portes, portet, portamus, portatus, portent. That looks very different, right? You're used to seeing portas, portat, portamus. Now you have an E there. That's how you know it's subjunctive. And the same thing is happening for the second, the third IO, and fourth conjugations, right? So this chart, if you want to pause it or copy and paste, take a screenshot, whatever, this is a handy chart to try to keep track of how you conjugate active voice. Now, the same thing is happening for passive voice as well, right? The only difference here is that you're changing your ending. So instead of MST, you're going RIST, where you're using the passive endings. But the vowel in front of the RISTUR has been switched, and that's what makes it subjunctive, okay? So present subjunctive is a little bit tricky because you have to kind of get used to seeing different vowels, which is weird. But once you get past that obstacle, that hurdle of just switching the vowel around, you can see the process is the same as indicative, right? It's just going to look slightly different with that vowel. Now, the second tense you're going to learn in this chapter is imperfect subjunctive. And of the two, I actually find this to be much easier, and I think my students do as well. For the imperfect subjunctive, all you do, right, is you're just adding the personal verb endings to the infinitive, right? So you're not actually dropping the RE on the infinitive. You're taking the infinitive itself, right, and adding an ending to the RE. So it sounds odd, but you're going to get the hang of it pretty quickly. That's all you do, right? There's nothing more to it. So if you look at a chart, this is imperfect active subjunctive. So for ambulare, I took ambulare and I added MST, must his son. So you get ambularem, ambulares, ambularet, and down the line. That's a pretty easy thing to spot. When you see an infinitive with an ending added onto it, you're like, oh, I've got it, imperfect subjunctive. That's all you're doing here. So there's literally no changing of anything, no vowels, nothing. Take the infinitive, add your endings, and you're good to go. Now, when you make it passive, it's the exact same thing. You're just using different endings. So you add r, ristur, mur, mini, ntur, okay? So again, for ambulare, you would get ambulare, right, with an er. That's just a distinct, sort of unique looking verb form. So I think in general, it's pretty easy to spot the imperfect subjunctive and to kind of form it on your own. It's the easier of the two. Okay, so now that we know a little bit, and again, pause the video here if you need to go back and practice this. On my website, I have magistrulas that'll help you with this. There's a lot of ways you can learn it. But now that you know how to form the subjunctive, that's kind of the easy part. What do you actually use it for? What's the point of this? Well, the one specific point we're learning in this chapter is purpose clauses, okay? So this is one specific use of the subjunctive. And these are dependent clauses, okay? They're used to describe the purpose of the main clause. So in other words, they don't really stand on their own. They're describing something about the main part of your sentence. They answer the question why, which is why we call them purpose clauses, right? What's the purpose of this? Why? That's what it's doing, okay? And again, because the subjunctive is in that gray area, right? That's why it's in the subjunctive mood, right? Because these purpose clauses are kind of functioning in that gray area. Okay, so a key thing you want to understand here, purpose clauses are introduced by ut or ne. Ut is the positive. You translate it as that or so that, right, more often than not. Ne is when you have a negative purpose clause. It's usually translated not or so that not, or if you want to really be fancy, you can say lest, right, which always makes my student laugh because nobody really speaks that way anymore, but you can, right? Some textbooks still use it. So what are we talking about? Well, it would look like this, okay? So if you had, for an example, and this comes out of the story, if you had nuntios ad civitates proximas mitunt ut ea gentes quoque consilia audiant et auxilium mitant, right? You're saying they send the messengers to the neighboring states. That's my main clause. It's indicative. That is a fact. Mitunt, they actually did send them. Ut is introducing the purpose clause, and it's a positive purpose clause. So you're saying the reason why they did this. If it were ne, you'd be saying the reason why they didn't do it, but this actually happened, right? So you're saying so that these peoples too might hear the plans and they might send help. Audiant and mitant are present subjunctives. Both of them were active voice in this case. So you can't really be certain that that's the actual reason why they sent messengers, but that's sort of the reason being given, and that's why it's subjunctive. Okay, this is an example of a negative one. So if you had a ne there, you're introducing a negative purpose clause. So if you had sementes quam maximas faciunt ne in opia frumenti in itinere sit, you'd be saying they make the greatest sowings as possible, or as great a sowing as possible, right? They're throwing seeds, we're going to see, so that there may not be. That's how you're translating ne sit. And I try to color code it so you can see what's going on. The ne is really so that not, and the sit is there may be, right? So you're saying so that there may not be a scarcity in inopia of grain. Frumenti is genitive there, on the journey. Okay, so it's a quick overview, but that should give you enough to kind of at least let you see a little bit of the grammar and understand it so that you can really set yourself up for this chapter. If you're still confused, pause the video, go work your way through the notes, the Magistrula on my website, whatever you might have, and you should be in a pretty good place. But try not to dive into the story until you feel comfortable with this idea of purpose clauses and the subjunctive. Okay, so that being said, let's dive in, translate the story, and see how it goes. Okay, so it starts like this. You have Helvetii multa diligenter comparant quod e patria exire constituerant. Okay, so you're saying the Helvetii, right? That's our subject here, the Helvetii. The Helvetii, and sorry, in this case, you want to notice that you don't have any subjunctive to start, so you don't really have to worry about anything yet. You're just indicating things. You're saying they are diligently, diligenter, comparant, preparing or making ready, multa, many things, because they decided, constituerant, to depart, exire, to leave, to go out of, or depart from their patria, a patria, right? So they decided to leave from their homeland, so they're getting everything ready. Then you have sementes quam maximas faciunt ne in opia frumenti in itinere sit. That's the line we just did. You're saying they make the greatest sowings as possible, meaning they're throwing seeds, so that there might not be a scarcity of grain on the journey. That's the negative purpose clause that we just set up, right? Sit there is the subjunctive of the verb esse. So we just saw that in our grammar overview, right? They want to be prepared, so they're throwing a lot of seeds. Then you have Jumentorum et carorum maximum numerum emont ut omnia secum facile portent. So here we have another purpose clause. You can tell by the ut, right, setting it up. So it's saying they buy emunt, they buy the greatest number, maximum numerum, of pack animals, jumentorum, and carorum, and carriages, so that, there's our purpose clause with ut, right, they might easily carry, facile portent, they might easily carry everything with them, omnia secum, right, so they want to be able to carry everything with them, so they need pack animals and carriages. Okay, then we continue on. You have nuntius ad civitates proximas miton ut ea gentes quoque consilia audiant et auxilium mitant. So this is the other example that we saw in sort of our grammar overview. You're saying they send messengers, right, to the neighboring states, ad civitates proximas. So they sent them so that, positive purpose clause, so that these peoples, meaning the neighbors they just sent to, they also might hear the plan or the plans, consilia, and they might send help, auxilium mitant, right? So that's the purpose, the reason why they sent out messengers. Then you have fortasse civitates se socios jungent et e finibus ibunt, okay? So you have perhaps, right, meaning it's still talking about the people and sending help. Perhaps the states, right, civitates, will join themselves as allies, right? Jungent is the joining verb. They might join as allies, right? So they, will join themselves, not might. They will join themselves as allies. So se socios, meaning join with the Helvetii. And they will, future tense, so jungent and ibunt are both future tense there. They will depart from their own lands, e finibus, right, from their borders or from their lands. Then you continue with Helvetii patriam relinquunt ut novos agros videant et fines multitudini hominem idoneos capiant. Okay, so here we're getting again more subjunctives. So you're saying the Helvetii patriam relinquunt means they leave behind, right? They leave behind their homeland, their patriam, their country. So that, ut, is a positive purpose clause, right? So that they might see, videant, they might see novos agros, they might see new lands, and take, capiant, they might take, fines, right, borders, they're described as idoneos fines, so suitable borders for the multitude, right, multitudini, hominum, of people. So in other words, it's saying they might grab or take possession of borders that better suit the size of their people, right? That was the whole idea. They need space, right? They need space to stretch out. Then you have magna est eorum space. So great was their hope, or you might say their hope, right? The hope of them, space eorum, is great. So they're feeling really positive about this, right? They're getting ready for the journey and they're feeling pretty good. Then you continue on to the next paragraph. You have Orgetorigis nobilissimus Helvetiorum erat civitatibus proximis amicus. So here we have Orgetorigis, right? And he's described as the most noble, nobilissimus, right? The most noble of the Helvetii. He was friendly, erat amicus, to the civitatibus proximis, to the neighboring states. So in other words, they know who he is. He's friendly with them. Then you have Dux igitur, delectus est ut finitimi consilia Helvetiorum benigne audirent et auxilium miterent, rather. So you have therefore Dux delectus est. So the delectus est, right, is just perfect tense passive voice. So you're saying he was selected or he was elected as Dux, as a leader, right? So therefore he was elected the leader. So that, ut, right, it's a purpose clause. Why did they elect him leader? It's positive. So that the finitimi, the neighbors, might kindly hear, benigne audirent, right? Now here we have an imperfect subjunctive, audirent, right? It's kind of describing the fact that it's happening at the same time. So at the same time as he was elected, the idea is the finitimi, right? The neighbors are going to hear, kindly hear his plan, right? So it says they might hear kindly, right? Almost like accepting his plan. The Consilia Helvetiorum, the plan of the Helvetii. So the idea is we're going to come to, and by the way, not only hear the plan, but auxilium miterent, rather, and they might send help, right? Send help. So the idea is if we send someone who's friendly, right, and someone they know, they'll be more willing to help us, right, and kind of receive our plan instead of sending a stranger. Okay, so it all kind of makes sense they'd send Orgetorigis. Then you have ad civitates iit, ut principes viderat et cum eis consilia caperet. Okay. So to the states, ad civitates, right? So to the neighboring states, he goes, right? So he goes, or he went to the neighboring states so that they might he might see rather. Videre is again imperfect subjunctive. It's an infinitive with an ending attached to it, so that he might see their chiefs, or the chiefs principes, right? It kind of means their chiefs, and with them, cum eis consilia caperet, form a plan or make a plan. So they sent him so that he could go, he could see the chiefs, and he could make plans with them. Okay, so that's the idea of why they would send Orgetorix. Then we continue on, right? And you have Helvetii cum finitimis pacem et amicitiam confirmare voluerunt ut omnia per eorum fine sine difficultate portarentur. Okay, so you have the Helvetii, right, with their neighbors, cum finitimis, right? So again, these are the neighbors they've been talking to, right? So the Helvetii, they wanted to make. So you have voluerunt, rather, confirmare. So they wanted to confirm or make pacem et amicitiam, peace and friendship with their neighbors, cum finitimis, right? So they wanted to make peace with them, so that, here's the reason why, it's a positive purpose clause, so that everything, omnia, right? Or you might even say, so that, everything might be carried, right, portarentur, per eorum fines, through their lands. So in other words, they're doing this so that they could carry everything through the lands. You just have a passive verb here. It's a rather a passive imperfect subjunctive, but so that everything might be carried through their lands, eorum fines, without difficulty, sine difficultate. Okay, so the difficulty there is warfare, right? They want to be able to do this without annoying their neighbors and making them think that there's sort of an invasion happening. So they ask for peace first, right? So they confirm, or they want to confirm peace so they can travel through their lands. Okay. Then you have erat mos gentes obsides intercedare ne injuria esset. Okay, so there was, right, erat, there was a custom for these people, right? Most gentes, there was a custom that excuse me, a custom to give dare, right? So to give obsides, to give hostages between themselves, inter se. So this is the custom, the most that they're talking about. What's the custom? Well, you would have a hostage exchange, which is a very common thing to do. So there was a custom that they would exchange or give hostages between themselves, so that there might not, ne is setting up a negative purpose clause, there might not be esset. So notice how that's the imperfect subjunctive, it's esse plus an ending, so that there might not be injuria, there might not be an insult, right, or insults. You don't want to insult anyone, so the idea is you would do a hostage exchange. So in this situation, the Romans do this too. Usually you give, it could be a high-ranking hostage, depending, but you give someone, and the idea is you're going to take my person, I'll take yours, and if we make it through peacefully and nobody murders each other, I'll give you your hostage back. But if you act up, the threat is that they're going to kill this hostage, right? So that's what's going on with this idea of giving hostages between themselves. The Romans love to do this too, okay? Then we get to the final paragraph. So you start with this. You have Helvetii cum civitatibus proximis pacem et amicitiam confirmare constituerunt, quo facilius per eorum fines iter facere possent. So one thing you want to notice in this in this sentence is you have quo at the end of it. Now, this is something I didn't really cover because, like I said, I couldn't do all of it in my intro to this video. But if you read through the actual textbook and get the notes on it, you'll see that while we usually introduce a purpose clause with ut or ne, right, there is an alternate. You could substitute ut for quo, and you do that when the purpose clause contains the comparative of an adjective or even an adverb. That's when you would use quo. So the facilius here, that comparative, is why we're using quo instead of ut. In terms of your translation and understanding, just think of quo as an alternative here. It's not going to make a difference, okay? So you have the Helvetii, right? Again, we're still talking about the Helvetii here. So you're saying the Helvetii, they constituerant, they had decided to declare or to confirm peace and friendship, pacem et amicitiam, right, with their nearby or their neighboring states, civitatibus proximis, okay? So they decide to do this so the quo there is really functioning as ut. It's a positive, right? But because we have facilius, you have to substitute it out. So you're saying they're doing this so that they more easily, facilius, they more easily could make a journey, possent, they are able to, or they could, iter facere, make a journey, right? Per eorum fines, through their lands or through their borders. So they make this peace treaty, everyone's feeling happy, right? They're going to move through the borders without any problem. So you have itaque orgetorigem miserant qui eas res conficeret. Okay, so, and so, right, itaque. So you're saying, and so they had sent, right, misera, they had sent Orgetorix, who, right, it's talking about Orgetorix, right, who was able or could or might accomplish these things. Now here's another thing that you're seeing with the qui there. So when you have a relative pronoun, qui, quae, quod, it can introduce a purpose clause. And you do that when the pronoun has an antecedent in the main clause. So in other words, since we were just talking about Orgetorix, right, with the orgetorigum there in the main clause, you can use the relative pronoun to set up a purpose clause. So qui is really translated so that. It looks like who, and honestly, it would kind of function the same way if you just said who, but you might have noticed conficeret there is an imperfect subjunctive. So that's what's going on there. So again, these are a lot of the rules and why I said you really want to dive into the grammar on this chapter. But this is an example of what the textbook was talking about. So you have, and so they had sent Orgetorix, you could say so that he might accomplish these things, eos res, right? So that he might be able to do these things, okay? Then you have the final line. You have said Orgetorix, regni cupiditate adductus alia consilia capit. Okay, but Orgetorix, and he's described as adductus, so having been led on, right? It's a perfect passive participle, so led on by the desire, cupiditate, there's the ablative, right? Going with the passive participle, by the desire of a kingdom. So you have sort of a side thought. You're ending by saying Orgetorix, having been led on or kind of influenced by the desire of a kingdom, alia consilia capit, he formed or he made other plans, right? You have this ominous ending to the first story in chapter 46, right? But it is mimicking what Caesar tells us. So he's going to do something different, and the something different that he's going to do, we're going to see in the next story, okay, when the story continues in chapter 46. So there's a lot going on here, and this video is definitely longer than some of the others. And even then, we can't fit everything into it. But chapter 46, in my opinion, is really a turning point chapter, these last 5. So 46 to 50, because you're diving almost exclusively into subjunctive. It's confusing, at least for my students. It takes a lot of practice. But again, this is where if you can do a really good job of reading through the notes, either through the Road to Latin notes, which again you can find either on a copy of the text or on my website, or if you're watching the videos that I gave you, there's some really good ones out there that will help you understand this. It's really critical that you get a good understanding of the grammar, because then you can use this story to really practice it and see it in action, right? It might only be one sentence. So in other words, that relative pronoun setting up a purpose clause, we only saw it once, but still it'll give you a sense of how this all functions. And the more you practice this, the better you're going to feel. So again, if you have any questions at all, anything you're not sure of, feel free to put it in the comments below, but otherwise practice, right? The more you read through this, do the read and reread method, the more attention you pay to the notes and really practicing it, using the Magistrula I linked on my website for even more practice. All these things will set you up for success so that hopefully you're able to read this story without too much trouble. Good luck.